All right, so next up, the guitar gear and his guitar tone and guitar style, which is always an interesting discussion and which is always something people are very interested in generally.
Sure. And, you know, a lot of the stuff is very well documented now. And there's been some stories over the years and some cagey behavior from Jimmy himself on what he used and which things back in the day when he was concerned about other people sort of taking his ideas or taking, you know, the gear he was into or something like that. But I mean, it's pretty well documented now. In his studio days, by the time he becomes noteworthy, he was one of the first people, I think, to have a black Les Paul Custom in the UK. And he used that on a lot of his sessions, but that guitar was eventually stolen. And he didn't get it back till, I think he may have gotten it back later, or Gibson ultimately put out a version of that guitar later, and he's got one. He played it in that celebration day, the one with the Bigsby, the black guitar, the black Les Paul with the Bigsby, the gold Bigsby.
With the bridge, with the...
Yeah. The Bigsby tremolo bridge, yeah. So there was that. And then in the Yardbirds, it was a Telecaster, and he was using an AC30 amplifier, a Vox AC30. We've talked about those in some of our gear podcasts. Before there were Marshalls, that was the British amp that most of the guys were using to get distorted tones. It's a 30-watt Class A British 212 combo, and they sounded loud and they distorted well, and you could get a lot of great sound out of those. And Beck was using them, Page was using them, Blackmore was using them, The Who was using them until they got into, you know, they really put Marshall on the map, The Who. And then, you know, of course, the Stones and the Beatles used Vox amps as well. So it was a British amplifier for British people, and this is what they had access to. And it was a distinctly different sound than the Fenders that were coming out of America. But it's funny, Jimmy Page using his Telecaster on the first Zeppelin album, he played that through a Supro amp, and that's a small, like 112-inch speaker amp that distorted really easily. And you have that album sounds very much like he's playing a Les Paul through a Marshall on his electric sound, for the most part. I mean, there is some Telecaster brightness in some of it at times. But I mean, we've talked about this before in some of the gear talks that we've had. Zeppelin 1, a lot of it sounds like a Les Paul through a Marshall, because I think that was the sound that Jimmy had in his head. And once he got in the studio, he knew how to EQ his sound to make it sound that way. And then soon enough, by the time he's on to the second album, he is using a Les Paul and a Marshall. But the other thing is, Supro is still around, and the reason they're still around is because of Jimmy Page. That's if Jimmy Page had never used the Supro, that company would have been gone probably before the 70s. But when he said, I used this on the first album and I used this on the solo to Stairway to Heaven, all of a sudden people started gobbling up Supro amps. And this is one of the reasons he got cagey about telling people what he was using, because it's like he couldn't find them anymore. All of a sudden, you know, he was to go get a new Supro amp or a replacement or whatever, or backup. And because it's in print now that Jimmy Page used these amps to get this sound, they're not available anymore.
Cool looking amps.
Yeah. I mean, it's just a little practice amp, really. It's tube, though. I mean, it was a tube practice amp. Because they didn't have solid state yet. But by the second album, Jimmy's on to his Sunburst Les Paul and early 100-watt EL34 amps, Marshalls, and I think he used some high watts in that era too, according to this Jimmy Page Anthology book. The other thing he said that no one knew until later, much later, was that live, I mean, you could probably find photographic evidence of this, but live in that early era of Led Zeppelin, he was using a Vox Super Beetle, which was I think 100-watt Vox amp. And he said they sounded really good. And, he toured with that, I think, in that, during the Denmark stuff that he was doing in the days of, early Zeppelin touring. He was using a Vox Super Beetle. He had Rickenbacker trisonic cabs, which are these odd-shaped, almost triangular, wedge-shaped cabs. All of this stuff is chronicled in this Jimmy Page anthology book now. I mean, I can go through this, but I mean, if you want the deep dive on Jimmy's gear, get this book. I mean, he talks about every little nuance of the aspects of things and the kinds of effects he was using at that time.
The Super Beetle is a solid state amplifier.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And
did he use it because it just got really loud while staying clean, or what was the?
I just, for whatever reason, he liked the sound of it, and for years he never mentioned that because he's like, if I mention it, I'll never see one again. And fair enough, that did happen. So anyway, from around the time of the second album and the second album tour, it's pretty much Les Pauls and Marshalls from that point on. And his main Les Paul is a 1958 that he bought from Joe Walsh. But Joe Walsh basically said, you have to buy this guitar, Jimmy. This guitar was meant to be yours. And Jimmy's like, he ultimately said Joe was absolutely right. And that's been his number one guitar ever since. And ever since then, he has largely been associated with Les Paul Marshall type of tone and was one of the guys who really did put that. He wasn't the first, but I mean, he was one of the guys who put that sound on the map and made that a tonal benchmark in heavy rock and what would become heavy metal.
Which model Marshall amp did he use?
He liked the hundreds. I mean, whatever, I think it's the 100 is the 1959 model, I think, or something like that.
Plexi?
Yeah, Plexis but I mean, Plexis were the earliest ones, but I mean, he was using them throughout the 70s. But he would use 4 to 6 cabs in his back line, 2 stacked, and the rest were on the floor.
That's a lot.
It's a lot, but it was not more than any of the rest of them were using at that time. It was interesting. He knew to keep them on the floor and out of his eardrums, except for the one where you needed to, if you wanted to hear it. Some of that you would use orange overdrives occasionally too, and with the Marshalls. I don't know. Some of that he would use the orange amps to run the Echoplex and the theremin thing. Sometimes I think he would use the orange amps in with his tone, but it was very much that British EL34 sound. Sometimes it sounded pretty thin on recordings live, his tone, but certainly on the albums it was very beefy because he was doing all the multi-tracking with this Guitar Army thing and stuff. Acoustic wise, he had a Harmony acoustic, which was a comparatively cheap acoustic compared to like a Martin or a Gibson. On the first album, he had a guitar made by Harmony, and it was a good sounding guitar, good sounding acoustic, and he used it a lot. And he used it a lot on the first album, and I think he used it on the second album. He borrowed an SJ200 to do "Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You" on the first album, so that's a different sound.
I think Harmony's not around anymore.
No, I don't think so. But his old Harmony acoustic was very much the sound of the early Zeppelin acoustic numbers. I think by the time he's on to Zeppelin 3, he's got a Martin D28 for his acoustic. And you certainly see that guitar on stage a lot when he's playing acoustic. It's a Martin by the time you get into the mid-70s.
Oh, yeah.
So there's that.
That's a serious guitar.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, of course, he recorded Stairway to Heaven not with the double neck. He recorded the acoustic part with an acoustic and the electric part with an electric. But to play it live, that's when the double neck came into play. And he's absolutely associated with this red double neck guitar that is iconic. And, he's got like a dozen of them or something like that. You see it in the book, in this anthology book. He's got many of these guitars now, but I think, at first he just had the one, and it allowed him to play the 12-string part on Stairway and the 6-string part on Stairway. And it became another part of this guitar god mystique that this guy's playing a 2-necked guitar at a time when not too many people had seen that.
Yeah.
And it's like, he's playing 12-string like a madman on Song Remains the Same, and all of these licks that are, it's hard to play a 12-string guitar. You get, those strings fight you a lot. It's like way more difficult to play 12-string nimbly than it is to play 6-string. So he was doing all of this stuff on the 12-string, and he'd play Song Remains the Same and Stairway to Heaven, obviously, and Rain Song. He would also play on the double neck.
Yeah, and that double neck Gibson wasn't officially around anymore when he wanted one, and then Gibson
they had to made one for him.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a picture, I think, before Jimmy had one. I think there's a picture of Pete Townsend playing one in black and white, and there's even a picture of Elvis with one of those things.
Really?
Yeah.
It's such a cool looking thing, man. Like just like one neck is not enough. It's
the guy who made it iconic is Jimmy.
Yeah.
Clearly. And other people then who were super influenced by Jimmy. Alex Lifeson got very famous for playing. He had a white one.
Slash had
Rick
one
Emmett
too at one point.
Yeah, but he's not really associated with it. Rick Emmett from Triumph had a double neck Ibanez Artist, which must have weighed like 25 pounds. Those guitars are very heavy. The Gibson is at least based on the SG. It's not based on the Les Paul. If you had like a double neck Les Paul, no one would be able to lift it. They'd be so damn heavy. But the SG was still 11, 12 pounds or something like that.
Maybe Zach Wild could do that. But.
Yeah, of course. And but it's like those things, I know for like 20 years, Rush didn't play the double necks because they got to where like, we're too old for this. And towards the end, they busted them out again on occasion. But Jimmy Page is the guy who really was the first guy you really saw with a double neck guitar, and it still looked like immensely cool. And it just added to that, whole thing. He had that whole thing in his image and everything. Yeah. And then he had this other guitar called a Danelectro 59, which is really a cheap guitar. Danelectro makes, they're still around. They too are probably still around because Jimmy Page put them really on the map. But they made guitars out of composite that are kind of like, glorified cardboard, really. That's what they're made out of, really, like some sort of a composite particle board rather than wood. They're hollow bodied. And Jimmy found that they had a really interesting sound for doing certain kinds of things, like the stuff he would do on White Summer and Black Mountainside. And he would also play that one on Kashmir a bunch. He also there were times he played Kashmir on the Les Paul, but I mean, you frequently would see him bust out that for Kashmir.
I find that they kind of have like a surf rock Beach Boy type guitar sound a bit.
Not so much the way he uses it, but yeah. I mean, for him, I think it has this resonant quality that you don't get from a solid body.
Yeah, there's a few times I just picked one up in the guitar store and played around with it. I was just like, this sounds like the Beach Boys. That's the first thing I think of.
Right. And then after Led Zeppelin, as he got back into doing like the Firm, that band was associated with his brown Telecaster. He has a Telecaster with a Parsons white B-string bender on this thing, which is a bizarre device that when you basically... It's built into like the strap lock so that if you push down on the neck, it pulls against the strap, and your B string, the note you hit on the B string, will bend.
Oh, wow.
And it gives you sort of like a pedal steel sound, like a twangy kind of thing. It's got a very limited usage, in my opinion. I never thought that guitar sounded like much of anything. He seemed to love it in that era. I never liked the way that guitar sounded personally. And I've never been a fan of what he did with the Firm, even though some of it's okay. But I mean, sonically, it just wasn't to my liking.
It's an interesting mechanism, man.
Yeah. It was Graham Parsons, I think, is the guy who invented that thing with this guy.
Gene Parsons.
Gene Parsons. Yeah. Gene Parsons and whoever White was.
Yeah, you can have one custom built for $6,000 if you want.
Yeah, and listen first and see if it's a sound you give a crap about, because it's, like I said, it's got a very limited use. So he had that going for a while, He has used Strats on occasion. The most notable place you hear a Strat is on the track In the Evening, where he does the whammy bar dip in that song, and that's a Strat. Mostly he would use it in the studio. If he was playing that, I did see he would play that. He would pull it out and play it. If he was going to play In the Evening live, he would pull it out. But you don't see him with a Strat very much. He was experimenting with Paul Reed Smith around the time of Outrider, but because that was the thing to do in those days. Everybody was in that. That was like the late 80s, and people like Gary Moore and Jimmy Page and people who were Alex Life, people who were not noted for using Paul Reed Smiths were using those or trying those out because most of them had been Gibson players, and they, were told that this is sort of a higher quality Gibson-ish type of guitar, and we've talked about that too in our gear talk. It's a hybrid sound, and not one of them stayed with that guitar ultimately. Even Alex Lifeson at the end was back to playing Gibsons, and Page and Gary Moore stuck with it even less. They only used it for like a brief period. But for all intents and purposes, Jimmy Page we associate with the Les Paul. It's an iconic association. That and the double neck. When you think of an image of Jimmy Page, you think of him with a Les Paul, or you think of him with that double neck. Even though the Telecaster in the early days was very prevalent, and it was always used in the studio. He still used it in the studio.